My new book is called The Accidental Apprentice. It's really a book about discovering yourself. Life tests us in myriad ways every day. And yet, till that happens, we don't really know what we are capable of, what we can do, what our limits are. So, in a way, this book is a process of self-discovery. You might call it a coming-of-age novel, but it's about a 23-year-old girl called Sapna Sinha, who's thrust into an extraordinary situation when an eccentric billionaire called Vinay Mohanacharya, who's India's 8th richest person, offers her the opportunity of becoming the CEO of his business empire worth $10 billion. In return, she has to pass 7 tests from the textbook of life. So really these 7 tests, are going to test Sapna like she has never been tested before. And I want the reader to really root for Sapna and to find out what happens to her as she goes through these 7 tests. Well, as Vinay Mohanacharya says, he's not taking her back to school. A school simply tests your memory, but life tests your character. So these 7 tests, he says, are from the textbook of life. In fact, as you know, every day we make choices and we have to suffer the consequences of those choices. So these 7 tests are really about the choices that life thrusts upon us, every single day, and how we respond to those challenges. Absolutely, I think since the tests form a very integral part of the narrative, I had to think very carefully about, what I want to introduce through the medium of those tests. And I write very structured books, high concept novels which are very structured and which are able to capture a slice of India at that particular point in time. So in Q&A, as you know, there were 13 questions. In 6 suspects, there were 6 suspects, and 13 minus 6 is 7, so I had to do 7 tests. And the idea really is to reduce the complexity and contradictions of India into a more manageable form, into a more palatable form. No, absolutely, I think, we have the saying that, the world looks different from where you are sitting. So obviously, when I'm trying to recreate the reality of India through the prism of a subject, then that subject's upbringing, that subject's social background becomes very, very important. And Sapna Sinha, I would say, is probably a representative of the lower middle class. I mean, her father was a mathematics teacher in a school in Nainital, so she had a convent education, she had a good education, she is very intelligent, but circumstances have now forced her to work as a sales girl. She has sort of given up on her dreams in order to cater for her family's requirements and family's needs, but she retains a very strong moral compass inside her. As I am fond of saying, my books may not have a message, but they always have a conscience. And I think the conscience of this book is Sapna Sinha. Absolutely, I think, women and men are not only biologically different, I think emotionally also, the way we approach a certain subject, the way we look at the world is different. So trying to look at the world through a woman's eyes was very challenging, especially for a male author, because you can be accused very easily, oh, you don't know, men are from, Mars and women are from Venus and the twain don't meet. So I again use what I call the quality of empathy. I try to put myself in Sapna's shoes and really try to look at the world from her point of view. So when I traveled in the metro from Connaught Place to Rohini, which is where Sapna is supposed to reside, I tried to imagine myself as a woman and to see how I would perceive the world. No, I think all my books are very character driven also. I like books in which there is a plot, of course, and there is also a strong character or characters that you can identify with, that you can relate to, and characters who are interesting enough for you to want to find out what happens to them next. So Sapna Sinha, I think, is one of those characters. She's a 23-year-old girl, she's a 23-year-old sales girl in Delhi. She goes by metro every day to work, and she could be really any of those anonymous, young women that you see in Delhi every day. And I have really tried to look at the world, at India, through the eyes of this young woman. And again, through the 7 tests, I am trying to cover a broad terrain. I am trying to capture some of the issues that contemporary India is grappling with. All my books are really about ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary situation. In Q&A, you had a humble waiter, 18-year-old Ram Muhammad Thomas, participating in the biggest quiz show on earth, which offers ₹1 billion. In 6 suspects, you had Munna Mobile, ordinary mobile phone thief, suddenly coming in possession of a suitcase full of cash, and what happens afterwards. And here now, you have Sapna Sinha, an ordinary, humble sales girl, who's in in a way you can say she's in a rut. You know, every day is the same, nothing ever changes. She goes to office, she comes back, you know, and you know, she just has her dreams to look forward to. And then suddenly, out of the blue, she's made this offer that become the CEO of my company, of a $10 billion company. So how does an ordinary person cope when an extraordinary situation is thrust upon her? I think that is the subtext of the novel. I would call it a moral fable wrapped up in a thriller. You know, the world of Q&A was a black and white world. You know, you had the good chaps and you had the bad chaps, and everything was very clear. Six Suspects, the world is very grey. None of the characters, in fact, at first glance, is very likable. You know, they're either very vain or very arrogant, very presumptuous. But I wanted to make them so interesting that the reader is compelled to find out what happens to them next. But in a way, The Accidental Apprentice is a reversion to the world of Q&A. That there is Sapna Sinha, and she, I think, is a character that the reader should be able to root for, should be able to relate to. And of course, she's thrust into an extraordinary situation. And I want the reader to really relate to Sapna Sinha as she goes through that, because in a sense, all of us are underdogs at some point of time in our life, whether we like it or not. We are all underdogs. You know, sometimes we feel that the situations that we are confronted with are too grave, are too important, and that we are too inconsequential, or that we are too powerless to be able to change that future or to change that situation. So through the medium of this novel, again, the message is of optimism and of hope, that eventually, you know, through a test of fire, you can discover what you are capable of and what you really want. In order to create an authentic backdrop, I think research is essential, because if you do not research your subjects, your backgrounds, your locations properly, then people are going to see through it very, very quickly. You know, even though I live outside India, I feel very connected to India. In fact, the first thing I do every morning when I open my computer is I log on to all the websites of the major Indian newspapers. I get my daily dose of what's happening in India. And that's a very good way of keeping in touch with, you know, contemporary India, what's really happening on a day-to-day basis. And as you all know, a lot of things have been happening in India these last 2-3 years. So this book was really written, you know, I started this book almost 2 years ago. So some of the issues that were happening at that time, you know, when the Cricket World Cup was happening, some of the other issues that were happening around that time, some of those have obviously filtered into my current novel. In total, it took me about 18 months to finish this book from beginning to end. You know, I call myself a weekend writer. I have a day job. I'm presently posted as Consul General of India in Osaka, Kobe in Japan. So out of 10 weekends, I get only 3 weekends free in Japan. But when I write pretty fast. So what appears is, you know, my first draft, or at best my second draft. I don't have the luxury of doing 15 drafts and, you know, continuing to refine my book time after time. Well, yes, actually that's an interesting point, because we had a range of titles to choose from. You know, this was not even my original title, but my publishers, you know, they do the marketing research, and they came up with this title, and they said that this is what we believe captures the book the best. And as you know, the old adage, any fool can write a book. It takes a genius to sell one. So I had to defer to the geniuses at my publishing firm. Initially, I had thought of a very simple my working title was The 7 Tests of Sapna Sinha. No, absolutely. No, this is again a choice that the writer has to make, you know, because you are confronted with a range of subjects, with a range of issues. And India really is probably the most complex country on the planet. There is no doubt about it. So no one book or film can actually ever even imagine to reduce the entire complexity of India into one book or one film. That's not possible. You can only capture a slice of India. And you know, there are various devices that you use to capture the slice. For instance, in Q&A, through the medium of the 12 or 13 questions, you are trying to capture, you know, various things happening in India. In 6 Suspects, through the medium of the 6 Suspects, you are trying to capture as broad a spectrum of Indian society as possible. You know, you have a tribal from the Andaman Islands, you have this humble mobile phone thief, and you have a Bollywood superstar, you have a posh bureaucrat, and people like that. So the idea is again to reduce the complexity of India, make it more manageable. And again, through the medium of the 7 tests, Sapna Sinha is encountering different situations. So I have commented for example, on the reality show culture, which is plaguing Indian television these days. There is an echo of the Anna Hazare movement also, again in a very fictional sense. These are some of the contemporary issues again that I thought it was important to engage with. I wouldn't say, I think it would be very presumptuous to say that, because I still believe when Mahatma Gandhi said that India lives in its villages. And if you look at the demographic, I think the rural population is still much more than the urban population. But having said that, since I am a city dweller myself, I cannot really claim to represent village life in very authentic detail, because that is something that I am not very familiar with. But having said that, there is one of the tests is set in a village in Haryana in the current book.